Hello, I'm Celia Halsey, and I'm pleased to be with you again to offer you some more stories from the hospital albums. This is the third in a series of three, and we've been looking together through some previously unseen photographs and images of this remarkable hospital. I've been working with CW Plus, which is the charity which supports Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. And together we've put together an exhibition which opened last year and is on display in the lower ground floor in the outpatients department. Well, as part of putting that exhibition together, we discovered so many photographs and stories which we simply couldn't fit into the exhibition. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to share some of those with you. This time, I thought we'd have a look at the changes in nursing life. Over the years, nursing life has changed considerably, but nurses have always been the bedrock of any hospital, and in particular this one. So there are stories which go back to 1716, which was the first nurse who was employed. Her name was Jane Alden, and she gave many years of loyal service. She finally retired in 1734, 16 years of service, and was very highly regarded. Now, in those early days, just over 300 years ago, nurses were poorly paid and were often uneducated working class women who were little more than cleaners, really. Jane Alden began to change that. She began a long history of Westminster Hospital nurses setting the trend for the professionalisation of nursing. So I'm going to begin our story and in our album, it begins a little bit later. The nursing profession had been through a variety of changes, not least prompted by Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War, with which she is associated. She revolutionised training. But Westminster nurses had been hugely regarded a full 9 years before that happened. In 1847, Westminster Hospital were the first to use the term a trained nurse, someone who was actually trained to do nursing. So let's have a look at those pictures. I'm going to open our album with you. Nursing life. I'm going to take us up to 1874. This building was in Queen Anne's Gate, and it was the first training school for Westminster nurses. Over the door across the top, you can just about see some lettering, and it said the Westminster Training School and Home for Nurses. This had been opened by a Miss Mary Merriweather. She had come from the Liverpool Royal Infirmary, where she and her sister had pioneered a training scheme. The governors of Westminster Hospital knew that they wanted to improve their training of nurses, and so they commissioned a report to look at what other hospitals were doing, and they discovered that they were paying about half of what other hospitals were paying their nurses. They also knew that their nursing standards were not up to standards. So they were particularly impressed by what the Mrs. Merriweather, two sisters, had been doing in London at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary. So they invited them to come down to London, which they did. Miss Merriweather became the lady superintendent of the training school, and her sister, Miss Elizabeth, became a matron of the hospital. Basically, the nursing was supplied by the training school for a set fee, which they were paid by the hospital governors. Having the matron and the training school separate only really worked for the first few years because the two were sisters and they had a close working relationship. When the matron died, Miss Elizabeth died in 1880, it became necessary to amalgamate the two. So they then had a matron superintendent who was in charge both of nursing in the hospital and of the training. The training was quite rigorous, and they became very well known. Westminster nurses were highly regarded. At times, they were known worldwide. And there was a time a little bit later when the Westminster nurses were allowed to travel without passports, free travel, if you like, throughout Russia, because the then Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, was so impressed when he encountered Westminster nurses, he gave them unrestricted travel across his realms. Well, in 1887, when Queen Victoria was celebrating her Golden Jubilee, she wanted to institute a kind of order of merit, if you like, for nurses. So the Order of St. Catherine was established, and the first 3 members of that prestigious order were Westminster nurses. And here's a picture of them. They were given a badge to wear on their left arm, and you can just see the nurse showing the badge on her upper arm. It was a oval badge, which was green and white, and had the letters SK written in gold in the middle. And they were hugely highly regarded because they were paid an additional £50 on top of their salary for 3 years. And the training school who had trained them were also given £50 per nurse awarded. So Westminster Training School was doing very well. The very first 3 were awarded this honour. So let's have a look at these matrons. They were fairly formidable, but they did the most extraordinary job. The person we have here is seated Miss Pine, who was matron from 1880 to 1898. And standing beside her was her assistant, Miss Cave, who later went on to become matron after the death of Miss Pine in 1898. They had inherited quite a tightly run ship. So their predecessor, Miss Pine's predecessor, had been a Miss Eager. And she was the one who really began the training of nurses in 1847. This was a full 9 years before famous Florence Nightingale revolutionised nurse training out in the Crimean War. But already Westminster nurses had had strict timetables. They had had a uniform instilled upon them. They had very particular rules and regulations that they had to follow. And their training was extensive for the day. Well, when Miss Cave, previously the assistant, became matron, here she is, around about 1899, we think, seated in her armchair in her parlour, matron's parlour. I think she's rather proud of that room. Look at that glorious splendour of a Victorian parlour, complete with aspidistras, the piano, the photographs. Very comfortable room. It shows her status. The matron's status was considerable in the hospital, still is today. We don't know who this is. She's clearly a trained nurse. It's a very early photograph. We think it's dated from around about 1880, which would only have been a number of years, 10 years or so, after the introduction of the uniform. So I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about her uniform. Stiffly starched apron and an extremely stiff collar and cuffs. She's wearing around her waist, you see hanging from her apron waist, the thing hanging down is called a chatelaine. This would have been a collection of little chains, and on the end of each chain were all the useful things she needed. That would have included scissors, it would have included any keys with which she was entrusted, and it was a kind of status symbol, and it showed that she's a trained nurse, fully qualified. She's wearing a little lace cap, which subsequently go on to become quite a trademark of Westminster nurses. They were affectionately known as frillies, and you were given your frilly when you fully qualified. Love to know what her name is, but we just don't know. Well, training modernised, and by 1939, when the hospital moved from its position opposite Westminster Abbey to St John's Gardens, a new the nursing training school was incorporated into the building. The nurses were accommodated and trained within the building. That was never intended to be permanent. By 1960, a new training school was built on Page Street behind the hospital, and it was state of the art. Here we have some nurses training underway. The training sister was called the tutor sister, or sister tutor, I believe, and she's the lady in dark, in the dark dress. And here we are. This, I think, is about 1961. We've got some photographs which were taken for publicity purposes, rather staged, they look to me. The nurses are in their lecture rooms, and then they're shown around a bed, but there were actually some dummy wards. So before they were released onto the wards, they practiced their bed making and their turning of patients and their handling of patients on dummies, which was apparently quite a source of entertainment, before they were actually began a series, a rotation of 6 months of training on different wards. So you began in the classroom and you continued your training on the actual wards on the job. And after you finished each of your 6 months on a ward, you were given an appraisal. Now, when we've been putting together the exhibition last year, we did a lot of work in the hospital archives, and we discovered all sorts of things. And this little slip of paper doesn't look totally exciting, but till you actually start to consider it for a moment, it's not a very good photograph, I apologise for that, but it does show in 1947 that a nurse, Elizabeth Margaret Chain, was assessed, I don't know which ward, it doesn't actually say which ward, PP2, I'm afraid I don't know what that means. But what's interesting is what they're being assessed on and the qualities which they had to display. And you perhaps a little small there, but I shall read them out in this order. Punctual. Is the nurse quiet? Is she neat and clean? Is she active and reliable? To which point this assessor has said yes, and most efficient. Is she careful? Yes. Is she obedient? Yes, she is. Is she patient? Most patient. Is she good-tempered? Always has a smile on her face. Is she observant? Very. Is she intelligent? That's right at the bottom of the list. Very. Sister's signature, and then underneath, as an addition, she's written an excellent nurse. But what strikes me is there's nothing in there about her knowledge or what she understands and what she doesn't understand about nursing. It's about her qualities. And if you like, I think it would even be agreed today that these are qualities which nurses are renowned for today. They do all display these qualities, and it's rather lovely to see this written out. So congratulations to Nurse Elizabeth Chain, 1947. And then along comes the great day when training is finished and nurses are awarded their certificates. They were also awarded a belt buckle, and the Westminster belt buckle was a lozenge shape, sideways lozenge, with a Westminster portcullis in the middle. Well, in 1953, there was a very special occasion when Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother, came to distribute the certificates. It was only a year after King George VI had died, so here she is. She's actually in black, she's in mourning, but she's giving the awards to the nurses. And I like the way they're all so smartly dressed. They've all got their white gloves, very crisp, starched aprons, and their frilly caps, the prized frilly cap. Well, the following year, they managed to invite Dame Margot Fontaine to do the same job. They'd have a different person each year. So here's a photograph of some nurses with their certificates, very happy with Dame Margot Fontaine in the middle. I think these nurses are actually nurses who had trained at the Westminster Children's Hospital. And I can tell that because they're all wearing an oval badge on their apron. And you probably can't see, but if you look with a magnifying glass, which I have done, within that badge, there's the emblem of the Children's Hospital, which was the swaddled bambino, the baby in swaddling clothes, which was the emblem. And their belt buckle was oval, and it also had the bambini in the belt buckle. Happy day. Well, in 1936, the new hospital provided a new space for a fairly new therapy, which had begun actually a few years before in 1919, following World War I, which was the beginnings of physiotherapy. Physiotherapy was then known as medical massage. And a school of medical massage had been opened in Westminster Hospital in 1919 because there were so many wounded after World War I who needed help to get moving again. And the School of Medical Massage really was the very beginnings of physiotherapy. It was right up there as one of the first training schools. Now, this gymnasium, I think this is taken in about the 1930s, and it was fairly newly equipped. It looks ghastly equipment to me. That neck stretcher, I think, is being demonstrated. This is all students demonstrating. They all wore their gym slips because it was a gymnasium. So she's having her neck gently stretched and supported. She does have something to hang on to, but it looks, with that wheel behind her and the girl beside her pulling a rope to stretch her neck upwards. Oh, my goodness. And in the background, you can see two trainee physiotherapists with holding onto a bar. Those were for wrist exercises. And the bars at the side of the wall, you can see just here, they were used for, there was a rheumatism gymnasium as well. It was for treating people with rheumatism. So those bars were for doing pull-ups to get you moving. Subsequently, this school joined up and became part of the Royal College of Physiotherapy. Well, nurses on duty. Here we've got a rather nice picture. This is just before the new hospital opened in St John's Gardens. Before the patients arrived, all the beds were having to be made up, and this is a photograph of two nurses changing or putting sheets on the beds. The nurse's routine was quite different in a way today, because an awful lot of it was cleaning and changing beds and just a sort of personal care of patients. Today, the patients stay far shorter time in hospital. This is one of the big differences. Over the years, patient stays have reduced to an average of a few days these days. At this time, the average would be about a fortnight. So there's a lot of personal care was required in that time. So here they are changing some sheets. There was a lot of giving of tea, just like it is today. This is a nurse. I think this photograph was taken during the early stages of World War II. After the evacuation of the soldiers from Dunkirk, many of those wounded arrived in Westminster Hospital, and these are two soldiers who had escaped from Dunkirk, and the press photographers came around and took some pictures of them, looking very relieved and happy, being nursed back to health, and given copious quantities of tea. I have a feeling that this nurse might be a military nurse. She doesn't look to me like a Westminster nurse. She doesn't have the belt. Her armband appears to have some kind of crest on it, which isn't Westminster. I think it's quite likely that there were army nurses were drafted in to help the influx. But this certainly is a Westminster nurse, and she is tending a Japanese seaman who had been mined and wounded. I have no idea what he was doing in Westminster, but he obviously made the press, and he's looking very pleased to be given treatment on his injured knee. It's probably a shrapnel wound, I should think, that's being very tenderly cared for and stitched by the nurse. You can see her frilled cuffs and her frilly cap. And this is also taken during World War II. This was a gas drill. Mercifully, gas masks were never required in earnest. But at the beginning of the war, there was great fear that they were going to be, and there was a great emphasis on training to how to use your gas mask and getting used to it. And that included getting babies used to the gas helmets. They were put completely inside this contraption. They could see out. You can just see a glass face cover at the back. The baby's face will peer out of there. They were completely sealed inside, and there had to be a nurse hand pumping the filtered air into that helmet the whole time. So you had to have one nurse per baby, or maybe they could pump 2 at a time. The baby doesn't look very happy about it. I'm not surprised. Well, in 1951, there was a very particular role that Westminster nurses played, and this has gone down in the history of the hospital as one of our proud moments. The King George VI was most unwell with a lung illness and had to have an operation, and it was all quite secret. In those days, news was not sort of sent round quite as readily as it is today, and the King's operation was kept largely under wraps, even from the rest of the staff of Westminster who nursed him. These are the 4 nurses who were sent off to Buckingham Palace to nurse the King after his operation. For those who maybe saw episodes of The Crown, the first series, this whole episode is told in quite some detail. They set up an operating theatre in Buckingham Palace, and a surgeon from Westminster Hospital operated on his lungs. And these 4 nurses, one of them is a theatre nurse, and the other nurses nursed him in his convalescence. They were sent off in top secret to Buckingham Palace for a number of weeks to nurse him back to health. Even their colleagues did not know where they had gone. But it was only afterwards, when King was safely recovered, that it all came out. And this photograph was taken of matron Lavinia Young congratulating Nurse Sarah Minter on a job well done, which is rather lovely. And to say thank you, the Queen Mother visited Westminster Hospital. She came again the following year, as we saw earlier, to give out the nurses' certificates. But here she is coming to say thank you to the staff who had nursed her husband in his last, what turned out to be his last illness. But nurses do have some time off duty. They work extremely hard. And this rather lovely picture was taken during World War I. There was a nursing home, or it was originally called the Queen Mary's Hospital, out in Frognall in Sidcup in Kent, and it was staffed by Westminster nurses. It became the pioneering hospital of plastic surgery, which was sadly needed very much so after World War I. The nurses had I think quite a comfortable life because they were out in the country. Frognall House was a beautiful mansion house, really, with gorgeous gardens, and the nurses had some nice common room, and it was all very pleasant. A lot of hard work, a lot of grueling work, obviously, but here they are having a bit of time off reading. I think it's slightly staged photograph, but it's a charming picture. You can see that the nurse nearest us is fully qualified. She's got her frilly cap. The one in the middle is a trainee nurse. She's not got her frilly cap. She's got a sort of more of a headscarf. And Christmas. Westminster nurses have had lots of traditions at Christmas, and one that continued very much into recent memory is on Christmas Eve. The nurses would turn their nursing capes inside out because they had a scarlet lining, which is nice and Christmassy, and they would process around the wards and sing Christmas carols on Christmas Eve to the patients. And it was a lovely moment, and hugely appreciated. Here they are practicing around the piano. Looks like matron practicing with them. And they were about to set off around the wards. There was another tradition as well, that the surgeon on duty on Christmas Day was given the onerous task of carving the turkey. And I found some press photographs, which I'm not able to show you, I'm afraid, but which showed this operation in process. And the caption was, the operation was successful. Everybody got some turkey. And this is Christmas in 1937 in the children's ward in the hospital in Broad Sanctuary opposite Westminster Abbey. They'd obviously had a collection of toys and oranges and biscuits for the children at Christmas time. And they've got a lovely display of all these china-headed dolls and a lot of clown dolls. They were quite popular in the 1930s. The French Pierrot clowns are quite popular. Oranges were a treat, and which is the tradition of an orange in the toe of your Christmas stocking. But the children are all being given fruit and oranges and balloons. I like the way, well, I don't like the way, actually, they've got streamers hanging from the light fittings. I can't help but think that's a bit of a fire hazard, really. But they're always, nurses have done their best to raise the spirits of their patients, and here they are. And that's the end of today's album. It's been really lovely sharing this with you. I think it's proved to me that the dedication of nurses has gone back throughout time. There have been ups and downs. There have been times when, in its history, when nursing was not at all what we'd expect today. But I want to really dedicate this to all the hard work of nurses, which is ongoing. And so I hope you've enjoyed looking through this album with me. I've really enjoyed sharing it with you. Do say a warm, hearty thank you to the next nurse that passes your bed. I hope to see you again, because I'm going to be producing another series of 3 albums and collections. We're going to be looking at wonderful Westminster, wonderful things that we have in our collection, wonderful people who have been part of our history, and wonderful times of celebration in the hospital's history. I hope you'll join me for those. Goodbye.